Was this week's storming of the Capitol a genuine insurrection or just a clown coup? And how does our answer to that question inform how the left should respond? Tonight on Tysky Sour, I'm delighted to be joined by Sarah Jaffe, author of Work Won't Love You Back. And you will know Sarah because she's a great friend of this show. Sarah, how's it going?
Hello. It's good to be back, although weird circumstances.
You've also got, I hadn't done the introduction already, but we're also, as you can now see, joined by Francesca Fiorentina, the host of the Bituation Room podcast, who often appears on TYT, as we were talking about before the show. You have many strings to your bow.
Yes. News broke on AJ Plus, a weird YouTube show on AMC. I'll do anything. Honestly, you guys got jobs? You guys need internet content? I'm there.
Yeah, we'll definitely keep that in mind.
Socialist internet content. I'm there. Good to be with you, Michael.
It's very good to know. In the second half of the show, I'll be joined, of course, by Dalia Gabriel. We'll be talking about Britain's genuinely terrifying COVID stats. And I'll also speak to Dr. Yara Asi about the politics of vaccines in Israel-Palestine. We're going to finish the show by discussing how a shit poster became the world's richest man. As always, share the show link. We want to get more people in here watching this live. And tweet your thoughts on the hashtag Tysky Sour. What do you think about these protests? Were they something we should be genuinely scared of? Were they kind of funny? Are they a bit of both? What did you make of the guy cosplaying with horns? Tweet your comments on the hashtag Tysky Sour. Now, one final thing. If you didn't already know, we don't only stream on YouTube. We now also stream on Twitch. So if you like to get your political content there, do go to twitch.tv/Novara Media. So go and follow us there. Now, on this show, we're mainly going to focus on the fallout from Wednesday's events, because I know, if you haven't been living under a rock, you'll be aware of what happened when far-right Trump supporters stormed Capitol Hill. But we are going to start the show with sort of a very quick rundown to update you in case you were living under a rock, and to make sure it's all fresh in our minds before we talk about the implications. So what did happen? It all started with Trump speaking to a Stop the Steal rally. Now, of course, the Stop the Steal, what they believed was that Trump actually won the presidential election. It was all a fraud. And so what they wanted to do was Congress people to refuse to certify the election results. This is Trump speaking at that rally.
We're going to walk down Pennsylvania Avenue. I love Pennsylvania Avenue. And we're going to the Capitol, and we're going to try and give the Democrats are hopeless. They're never voting for anything, not even one vote. But we're going to try and give our Republicans, the weak ones, because the strong ones don't need any of our help. We're going to try and give them the kind of pride and boldness that they need to take back our country. So let's walk down Pennsylvania Avenue. I want to thank you all. God bless you, and God bless America.
So you just heard Donald Trump there. At the very end of his rally, he's instructing his supporters to walk down Pennsylvania Avenue. That's where the Capitol building is. Now, of course, as you'd expect, they followed his instructions. And when they got close to the Capitol building, you'll see here, the security wasn't very good. So the security had got round to putting up fences, but there seems to be, 4 or 5 people there, and the protesters don't have any problem at all getting through them. Once they get through those fences, as we'll see in a moment, they also don't particularly, it doesn't seem too hard for them to get into the Capitol building. Now, this being, the capital of one of the most militarized countries on the planet, it does seem surprising that it was quite so easy for them to breach that boundary. You can see, people have been saying, did the cops let them in? Here it seems like the cops are genuinely trying to, stop them entering the Capitol building. The problem seems to be more in this instance that there weren't enough cops there. I think in a you can see them there running up the steps. They're going to get to the Capitol building and smash some windows, as you can see there. This was streamed at the time, live on CNN. And in a moment as well, we can go to what was a really interesting ITV report, actually, where they managed to get inside and you can see what the protesters themselves were sort of chanting what they were doing inside the Capitol building.
In the very heart of the Congressional building. What's the purpose of storming Congress itself?
Because they work for us. They don't get to steal it from us. They don't get to tell us we didn't see what we saw. We respect the law. We were good people. The government did this to us. We were normal, good, law-abiding citizens, and you guys did this to us. We want our country back. We are protesting for our freedom right now. That's the difference.
As you can see, once inside the building, those scuffles did continue with the police. Again, we will show later that there were some cops who were sort of taking selfies with these protesters, but what it looks like more than anything is complete chaos. There were also lots of, in general, it didn't really seem that the protesters knew what they wanted to do. So here's them wandering around aimlessly on the Senate floor. To be fair to them, they probably didn't imagine it would be quite that easy to get to the Senate floor, but these don't seem to be people who had a plan as to what they would do once they occupied the halls of power. Now, from some of that footage, it can seem like a bit of a joke, especially if you see, the guy wearing all of the furs. But the politics of these people is terrifying. There were people with T-shirts on, Holocaust, almost celebrations. There was someone with a Camp Auschwitz T-shirt. Really, really awful politics, and not just awful, terrifying politics. That's to massively underplay it. And 5 people did die. So one was a protester who was shot by police. Another was a police officer who sustained injuries, policing the riot. We think that was with a fire extinguisher. Sounds pretty awful. And 3 people also died from medical emergencies, which at this point in time, we don't have that much more information about. Now, to bring you up to speed over what happened over the last 48 hours, which has been not quite as dramatic, but up there. So we have seen since then, Donald Trump, obviously, he came out and said, I love you, but please go home. And we've had many of his sort of cabinet ministers or cabinet members who have very, very bravely resigned 13 days before they were going to lose their jobs anyway, after serving Donald Trump for 4 years. It seems to be the case that the fact that cabinet members were resigning, there was rumors that maybe the 25th Amendment would be invoked, which would mean people removing Trump because he's unfit for office. That did get Trump to slightly change his tune. He spoke last night with in a different tone to that in the video he released on Wednesday. So in this video, he called it sort of a heinous attack. He said he was outraged by the violence, lawlessness, and mayhem, even though these were the same people he'd egged on. And then he also said this.
My campaign vigorously pursued every legal avenue to contest the election results. My only goal was to ensure the integrity of the vote. In so doing, I was fighting to defend American democracy. I continue to strongly believe that we must reform our election laws to verify the identity and eligibility of all voters and to ensure faith and confidence in all future elections. Now Congress has certified the results. A new administration will be inaugurated on January 20th. My focus now turns to ensuring a smooth, orderly, and seamless transition of power.
So that was the first time he said he will, not cling on to the White House. He is going to concede the election, although, and this is much less significant, let's face it, he did tweet that to all of those who have asked, I will not be going to the inauguration on January the 20th. This is when I want to bring in my guests to get their take on what all of this means. Francesca Fiorentini and Sarah Jaffe. What do you make of this? To what extent could we see this as an insurrection? Joe Biden's called it an insurrection. I've seen many people, many leftists on Twitter sort of call this an act of domestic terrorism. There are also people such as Glenn Greenwald, for example. He's sort of come out and said, we need to be careful not to get out of lose perspective on this because it could provoke some pretty reactionary policies from the state if we say that this act of civil disobedience, even if it was by far-right neo-Nazis, was itself an act of insurrection. That could quite easily be turned against the left. I want to start with you, Francesca. What do you make of this? How should we see what happened on Wednesday?
Well, to speak to the last point of whether or not this is going to be turned on the left, too late. It already has been. The entire apparatus of the police and of state violence has historically been turned on the left, on Black and brown Americans. Police forces in this country have their origins in slave catching units. So let's not pretend that like somehow, any new security, which there will be, is going to be, there's going to be a new chapter and BLM demonstrators are going to get their heads bashed in. Guess what? They've been getting their heads bashed in all of last year. This wasn't a question of whether we have enough police or whether there's enough surveillance. So both people on the left and people and liberals and anyone on the right need to, shut their little mouths about that one, because they're wrong. We have police in spades. You want an N95 mask? Gonna be hard. You want healthcare? Dude, just like full out, just today, bro. But we have so many layers of cops. I've protested in DC many times. We've all seen the footage. Like, if I watch that footage, I'm sure Sarah can feel similarly, but like, I think about if it were like people on the left protesting for global justice against the Iraq War. Eminem in the year 2004 released a whole music video. It was like, we gon' mosh, like we're gonna march on the Capitol because we don't want Bush reelected. I was like all about that. I was like, oh yeah, it would have been a bloodbath. We would have been murdered en masse. There's no way in hell anyone who actually is fighting for justice will get through. And last point, if we ever did get through, we do a much better job of locking down and actually requesting demands and getting them met. Non-violently, of course, militant nonviolence.
Yeah, I mean, Sarah, I want to bring you in on this because I think this is genuinely terrifying. I think what we saw there is genuinely terrifying. The politics of it, the outright, far-right anti-Semitic neo-Nazism, which has a very clear line to the president of the United States and is clearly not something which is alien to the rest of the Republican Party. I find that absolutely terrifying. The thing I'm less sure about is whether we should call an occupation of the Capitol building an insurrection, because we also have seen, obviously with a completely different politics, much less violent, we have seen sort of left-wing people do the same. And do we want to allow an occupation of a sort of government building to be seen as something which is inherently anti-democratic? I mean, obviously their aims are anti-democratic. I'll throw to you there before my question gets too convoluted.
Yeah, I mean, Michael, the first time you and I talked was about my first book, which talks about, among other things, the Capitol occupation in Wisconsin. Actually, literally the day this all went down, I was talking to the same person that I interviewed about starting the Capitol occupation in Wisconsin, because she now works at Google and is one of the founding members of the Google Union. So anyway, it's hard to sort of separate tactics from politics, I think, in a lot of ways. Like, you do see something, I keep thinking of the guy in the full soldier fatigues with the gas mask on, right? Like, there's a way that the various kinds of cosplay in these crowds can look sort of, again, like sort of both hilarious and terrifying, like the guy with the horns and whatever. And like, there's a long tradition of white settlers playing Indian to do everything from the Boston Tea Party to all sorts of violence against Native people in this country. But like, the way that we talk about this, I think, has to be more about the political content of these people than like the things that they did, for the most part. Not entirely, but like, the thing that I saw a lot of people saying was bringing up like the J20 protests from 2017 when Trump was sworn in, when a coalition of left groups working together managed to really significantly disrupt Trump's inauguration and sort of prevent a lot of people from getting there. And those people were threatened with like 70 years in prison, conspiracy charges, all of this horrible shit. They were hounded for years. And now the FBI is going like, these people who have their full faces on, because of course they're not wearing masks. Which, like, to Francesca's last point, like, dude, you have a legal reason to wear a face covering while you're doing this, and you're not even doing that.
Yep.
It's so stupid. But like the way that the law enforcement sort of acts like, oh, we could never have seen this coming, is ridiculous. And that's the thing. Like, we definitely have enough cops to have stopped this if they wanted to. A bunch of people were sharing the picture of like jackbooted cops on the steps of the Capitol building during the George Floyd protests last summer. They could have stopped this if they wanted to. They don't see these people as a threat, largely because the cops are Trump's base and they agree with those people. And there have even been some reports, I haven't seen confirmation of this, but that some of the people who were storming the Capitol were flashing their police badges or military IDs to get in. And this is, again, like, this is not new, right? Like I wrote about in that book, the way that the Oath Keepers, which is just one of many militia movement groups, most of their base is either former or current military or police. And there was actually a significant split during that between the military and the police, which is a whole other story we could talk about for 3 hours.
Can I just jump in real quick? Do you mind? I
Yeah.
just wanted to respond to that because I think I absolutely agree with Sarah. I think that the semantics are less important than the political motivations, which are white nationalism and white minority rule. And I'm on the semantics, I'm like personally hard pressed to be like, they're terrorists because like, well, they had the state behind them. So they're more like state terrorists. But I think ultimately it doesn't matter. What matters is the Republican Party has fomented this extremist right-wing ideology. And what they did the other day was essentially just a parliamentary version of what these, crazies tried to do, on the ground. There really isn't a lot of daylight there. So to me, going forward, it's about right-wing extremism. It's not about police, but it's not about beefing up police. It's about seeing the ways that the police have historically protected neo-Nazis. I mean, go back to anyone, Antifa's been sounding the alarm about this, and anyone who's done anti-fascist organizing knows that if you go to counter-protest neo-Nazis, the neo-Nazis get protected by the police and you get beat. That's just what happens. So what are we going to do? There needs to be an audit, not only of the police officers, and I know there's been resignations of Capitol Police and DC Police, but it's not just an audit about whether you're fit or whether you were there. Are you a white nationalist? Just like there needs to be an audit of every single police department in this country. So people who say, oh, the defund the police movement's really, taking a hit. No. In fact, this has only strengthened the argument that we need to reform and move funds out of the police department and into other places.
So I want to go to a couple more clips because what you're saying is the perfect segue to what we're going to talk about next, actually, which is, I suppose, the extent to which the ideas you've just articulated there, because of this action, seem to have actually percolated potentially into a much wider group in society than previously would have been the case. So I suppose just to get our audience used to the point of how the policing of this protest was different to previous ones. I'm sure you know this already, but we can see some footage of the police taking selfies with the protesters. This has gone absolutely viral because it's so outrageous. So you can see that's after they've broken into Capitol and you've got cops taking selfies with the white nationalist protesters. And actually, I'm also going to show you this video just because, as I said, this is terribly serious, but this shows you quite how much the protesters on that march expected to be treated with kid gloves by the police. This is Elizabeth from Tennessee, who seemed to be surprised that overthrowing the state, if you're white, is actually quite challenging.
What happened to you?
I got maced.
You got maced.
By the police.
And what happened? You were trying to go inside the Capitol?
I made it like a foot inside and they pushed me out and they maced me.
What's your name? Where are you from?
My name is Elizabeth. I'm from Knoxville, Tennessee.
And why did you want to go in?
We're storming the Capitol. It's a revolution.
That one keeps me going back to that bit in The Princess Bride. Bye bye, boys. Have fun storming the castle. It'll work. It'd take a miracle. But like, it is funny, right? Like, it is funny, but like, it is also, this was disorganized. This was a mess. This was a sort of, in many ways, mashup again of these various white nationalist groups. I mean, people have sort of pointed out a lot of these famous guys, like the guy in the horns, the Q shaman, right? He's like a well-known neo-Nazi, right? Like, these are people who are organizing their various little micro sects of fascism. And they don't all get along, which is good for us, because if they all got along, this would have been a lot scarier. But the thing that worries me the most about this, and the thing that has worried me since, I don't know, since I started thinking about this election, so probably back in 2017, is like, this is Tea Party 2.0, right? Like the Tea Party back in 2009, 2010, 2011, a lot of them did show up with guns back then, and they would have their, open carry marches, which are pretty clearly a threat. And that, somebody got shot back then. Like Gabby Giffords was shot in 2010 after Sarah Palin had posted a map on her website with targets and crosshairs over all of these congressional districts that the Republicans wanted to win. What does that look like when Trump is now in Sarah Palin's position? And when this is already the level that we're at? What does it look like when the Republicans are sort of losing? And like, I think about my colleague Vegas Tenold, who wrote a book called Everything You Love Will Burn about white supremacists, again, in the age of Obama. He was embedded with them for some 6 years leading up to, and he was with them on the election in 2016. And he was kind of saying that night that when Trump won, those guys were a little bit confused. Because when they're winning, they don't have the grievance. And this kind of politics, going back to the Confederacy, going back to like the dudes who are carrying the Confederate flag while chanting USA and also carrying American flags and Trump flags, that grievance, that sort of politics of white grievance, of taking my country back, like that comes out of that language, that history, which is violent. It's resulted in a lot of people being, killed, abused, beaten, arrested. And that's like old stuff, but it's now a lot more mainstream. It's a lot bigger. And yeah, I mean, what's Trump going to do when his Twitter account, I mean, he's already not using the president of the United States Twitter, right? He's still real Donald Trump. I guess Twitter suspended him now, though.
Oh, he's back.
I think that point about them not knowing what to do once they've won is really interesting. It reminds me of them, because once they got onto the Senate floor, as we showed there, they didn't know what to do. And if you compare that to the occupiers of Wisconsin Capitol building, they were there. We're staying here until you reverse your policies when it comes to school reforms and trade unionism. It was very, very concrete. This time, not so much. Before I go to you, Francesca, I just want to show our final clip actually about this, which is Joe Biden, who before. When you were talking about how people are sort of recognizing how differently the police treat different people in the United States, that used to be a very much a sort of niche leftist opinion. Now the president-elect is taking a similar line. We can take a look at that.
Not only do we see the failure to protect one of the three branches of our government, we also saw a clear failure to carry out equal justice. I'm sure if you used to say in the Senate, excuse a point of personal privilege. A little over an hour and a half after the chaos started, I got a text from my granddaughter, Finnegan Biden, who's a senior in her last semester at the University of Pennsylvania. She sent me a photo of military people in full military gear, scores of them lining the steps of the Lincoln Memorial because of protests by Black Lives Matter. She said, "Pop, this isn't fair. No one can tell me that if had been a group of Black Lives Matter protesting yesterday, they wouldn't have been treated very, very differently than the mob of thugs that stormed the Capitol." We all know that's true. And it is unacceptable. Totally unacceptable. The American people saw it in plain view, and I hope it sensitized them to what we have to do.
Now, the delivery there was very Joe Biden, but I thought that point being made by the president-elect was very interesting. I mean, he's referring there to the National Guard lining up when the Black Lives Matter protesters were protesting in the area, and how clearly different that is to how these protests were policed. So, Francesca, I want to bring you in now. Do you think that analysis, which you sort of articulated before, that the police are tied up with white supremacy in many ways, and don't police protests just because of the tactics they use, but also the politics they represent. Do you think that's now something which is going to become much more of a dominant understanding among American society? And in a way, is that also an opportunity for the left?
Oh, there's so many thoughts, but I do, look, I want to see a Biden administration make good on what he's saying. And that means both from the top down, doing the investigations that were begun under the Obama administration that Trump, cut off of these police departments. It means cutting off the amount of military weaponry that is being funneled from the federal level to the local level. It means all of those things. And it means empowering the FBI. As much as I do not like to say that, but man, I don't know how to go after extremists, but it means empowering them and figuring out how to best foil things like this. If anyone is surprised by this, they haven't been paying attention to the number of mass shootings and the number of manifestos, the amount of hate crimes that have surged under Trump and, of course, beginning under Obama, under the first Black president. So all the critiques of Obama stand, but white nationalism absolutely surged under his presidency. And so these are all the things that going forward, and this is what I think we have to hold. And I love the Wisconsin occupation as this example of, here are people who might otherwise be Trump voters, or the middle America, rural folks, people who've maybe been forgotten, the economically anxious. Like, we need to move forward as a country with concrete, bold plans that actually help people, jobs programs, right? More than just a stimulus check, like all kinds of healthcare plans, like all the things we've got to move forward on. But at the same time, calling racism racist and actually rooting out that kind of white supremacist extremism. I don't think you can root it fully out before we can get to work as a country. And I think the more the Democrats get to work, and now that we've got the Senate, the more we are going to neutralize some of that insanity, because they're going to see that, like, oh yeah, they're actually trying to help me. And like these policies of, when you get health care, you're healthy. You see how that works? So like that it's kind of a both and moving forward, and it's going to be hard.
I want to ask you, Sarah, about the Republican Party and the future of it, because as you said at the start of the show, as we talked about in that interview, I think it must be about 4 years ago, about your book Necessary Trouble. The Tea Party, it is part of the movement that became Donald Trump. So it was a fringe movement which ended up dominating the party. Many people thought that fringe movement was a chain around the Republican Party's ankle. They said these are all cranks who are going to make sure this party is never electable. It turned out actually that they took over the party and then got elected. So there's almost similar things being said this time around. People were saying these fringe groups which entered the Capitol, they're completely out of step with the rest of America. So this is now going to be something which brings down the Republican Party and means they can't get elected for ages. Do you think that's overly complacent? Do you think that, in fact, actually, people who storm the Capitol are going to be the next presidential candidates, not necessarily the guy in the first, but people who represent their politics and could quite easily get elected in 2024?
I mean, there were local electeds in those marches, right? That there were people who are state legislators in West Virginia and I think Tennessee. I'm not entirely sure on the details on that one, but I do know that there were definitely people who are local elected officials, party leaders. There was somebody in there who was a clerk for Clarence Thomas. Like, this is the Republican Party. Perfect. And yet also, and this is the tension that we have to sort of live in, is that like Trump, in that first clip that you played, in his first speech at that rally, where he talks about we're going to go pressure the weak Republicans. Trump and Trumpism and the Tea Party and these people have always relied on this sort of inside-outside relationship with the Republican Party. Because the thing is, like, the Mitch McConnells of the, like, all of this was happening. The big news of that day should have been that 2 Democrats took 2 Senate races in Georgia on the same day, and the black guy who's the movement candidate got a bigger percentage of the win than the white suburban Jewish guy. So that should have been the big news. Part of the reason that happened is that Mitch McConnell was so like just would not countenance giving people bigger checks, gave them something really to run on. Again, like Francesca was saying, that sort of economic, we are going to do something concrete for you. And Trump was, out there saying, we want $2,000 checks for people. And so the thing that has always scared me about Trumpism is the degree to which it is interested in at least superficially helping some working class people. That's the thing that made like Josh Hawley, who was out there on the floor with Bernie, right? Who was also going to vote to overturn the election results. Like people like that understand that they've got to win over at least some fraction of the mostly white, but not entirely white. Because again, Trump's percentages went up with Black and Latino voters this time. They recognize that they have to do some of that in order to win, that they can't just solely be focused on giving tax breaks to Elon Musk, who I understand you're going to talk about later in the show. They have to actually find a way to connect with the base. And so like thinking back to this book, and I don't want to spend all of my time talking about my first book, but I was thinking about J.D. Meadows, who is literally the story that starts that book. And he was this guy who was in a film made by Rick Rowley for Al Jazeera back in, again, the 2009, 2010, called White Power USA, that was explicitly looking at the way that these white nationalist groups, in this case, the Council of Conservative Citizens, which again comes out of the White Citizens Councils, which was like the upscale Klan, they are going to Tea Party rallies, finding people who are just sort of pissed incoherently about everything that's going on in the world, and explicitly recruiting them into these groups, calling it the Council of Conservative Citizens. That sounds nice, right? You don't think I'm joining a Nazi group. You don't think I'm joining white supremacists. But then what they do is they work really hard on organizing you into this stuff. And so the question of how we organize people out of that has to be like, in part, you get there before they get organized into the, white collar Klan.
And I just want to pick up on that and say briefly that there has to be accountability for the ways that inside strategy from Republicans has been giving, more and more leeway for these outside fascist groups, right? And so that's why, someone like Cori Bush, incoming freshman congresswoman, like issuing or trying to, what is it? What do you do? Is it a law? How do laws work? Was it a bill?
Introducing some sort of something to expel them from.
Yeah, exactly. To essentially force the resignation of Republicans who were voting against, which once again is a lie, like who were voting on a lie, who are continuing 147 Republicans between the Senate and the House, continuing to lie to the American people, effectively stoking what we just saw. Because if you actually believe that the election was stolen, then what they tried to do kind of makes sense. So it comes from the top on down. And I think Cori Bush is absolutely right. And others have signed on. But it's like, I don't imagine Ted Cruz is going to resign anytime soon. His facial hair just started working for him. Imagine as a man just resigning when you're just, you figured your haircut out. Yeah. It's a weaponized right winger.
But it is interesting to see that, again, Josh Hawley, who I'm kind of fascinated with, who also comes from Missouri, Cori Bush's state. I was joking that, you need to force his resignation and then give her his Senate seat. But the papers, the Kansas City Star that had endorsed him, came out with a very forceful editorial, not an op-ed, like the editorial board, saying that he has blood on his hands. So this is going to be a moment for people like Josh Hawley, who wanted to be, again, the next level of Trumpism, where they are going to get called on, like, are you in or are you out?
Yeah, the line has been drawn.
Or are you out with Trump and with, Q Shaman?
And that's on Democrats. I mean, that's solely on Democrats, squarely, to be like, this is the line. You're on this side or this side.
Although the worrying thing is that Ted Cruz thinks that by buying into the lie, that's going to help him in, the primaries in the presidential elections in 2024. So even if the Democrats exclude them from Congress now, then the people who get excluded are precisely the people who are going to come back and get elected in future. Although I do think that if you get done for insurrection, you can't stand for elected office.
I don't know if you are forced to resign or you resign or anything like that. But if you get convicted of treason, certainly you can't run for office again.
All right, we'll have to wait and see how much damage Trump can do in the next 12 days before then seeing how much damage the Republican Party can do over the next, oh my God, I don't even want to think about it. Sarah Jaffe and Francesca Fiorentini, thank you so much for joining me this evening. Genuinely insightful, all of your contributions. So glad you could speak to us today.
Hell yeah, thank you.
That was Sarah Jaffe and Francesca Fiorentini. Real lucky to get them on the show tonight. We are going to be speaking about so much more in the rest of the show. Oh God, I'm tired. It's a Friday night, but we've still got 3 big stories to go. Before we do that, if you're new to this show, make sure you hit that subscribe button. As you know, we go live every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 7 p.m. And also for special unannounced shows when anything big happens. Dalia Gabriel, you're muted, Dalia.
Hello. Sorry, that was entirely my
Hello.
own fault. What an amazing pair. That was such a good discussion. And yeah, I mean, we have a lot more to get through because the apocalypse is multifaceted. It contains multitudes. So there's still a lot more sort of horrible stuff to get through. But that was a really great segment. I really enjoyed that.
Yeah, actually clarified quite a lot of my thoughts because I have been a bit like, is it an insurrection? But it is white. I mean, the issue is it's white nationalism. Was it an insurrection or not? Was it white nationalism?
Yeah. Yeah, and I think it's an incredibly mobilizing moment for them, unfortunately. But yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, the idea that this is embarrassing for them is potentially a little bit complacent. Anyway, we're going to come back to the UK where we have almost equally dark news to go through because this has been another really, really dark, terrifying day in Britain's coronavirus epidemic. So in the last 24 hours, 1,325 deaths were recorded from COVID-19. Now that is by quite a way, actually, that the highest number ever recorded in this country over 24 hours, higher than anything we saw in March. I didn't think this would happen. I didn't think our political leaders would allow us to get into a worse situation than we were then, but we're here. There was another grim record, which is at 68,053 people tested positive for coronavirus in the past 24 hours, which again is a record. As you'll all be aware by now, the time lag in between infections and disease and becoming seriously sick with coronavirus is quite a while. So if we're seeing sort of cases still rising day by day, we're likely to see deaths rise day by day for at least another couple of weeks. So it's going to be a very, very difficult few days we have ahead, few days, few weeks, few months, in fact. And it's still unclear. This is what's very worrying, actually. It's still unclear when we're going to bend the curve of new infections. So as my guest Deepti Gudasani said on Wednesday's show, or was it Monday's show? I think it was Monday's show. She was saying that when we saw the peak in deaths back in March, we were already at the phase where cases were going down quite dramatically because we were already in a lockdown. Whereas now we've only just entered a lockdown, cases are still going up, so deaths are still going to be going up for quite a while. This could be a lot worse than March. Really, really grim. I want to show you now a graphic which sort of points out how much this could be to do with the new strain. Now, that's obviously not to excuse the government because they've known about the new strain for a while, and they made many mistakes before this, but it's to show that actually in many parts of the country, again, this could get worse. So let's get this up. And what it shows you on the left is the proportion of positive COVID tests which are of the new strain. And so you can see that the darkest blue means that more than 41% of the new cases are of the new strain. That's very, very prominent in London and the southeast, in Kent, as we've known for a while, and in the east of England, and in the northwest, and parts of the northwest. And as you can see on the graphic on the right, that's precisely where cases are very, very high. So it's in those places where the new strain is completely predominant that we're seeing cases that are as high as 1 in 100 people actually testing positive, which means that in reality there's probably more than that. And what this suggests, worryingly, is that once this strain becomes as dominant in the rest of the country as it currently is in London and parts of the northwest and in Kent, then we could see similar surges in cases, which is not what anyone working for the NHS needs right now, or I mean anyone in this country really. Now, this is, as I say, government will like to say, this is the new strain. What could we have done? they were told about this new strain. Well, they were told about this new strain back in October, but there are many new strains. They were told about the seriousness of this. It was confirmed to them how difficult it will be to control this pandemic when this new strain is out on the 18th of December. And we didn't have a lockdown until earlier this week. So that tells you quite how much this government have let this pandemic, this virus, spin out of control when they've had all of the warning that they needed. If you needed more worrying news, it's that the lockdown this time around, even with the new strain, so that the new strain already makes a lockdown, if it were exactly the same as it were in March, harder to contain. But also this lockdown isn't as effective in terms of how people are behaving as the one we had in March. So this is a tweet from Jason Groves. He's from the Daily Mail, but he's just reporting on a press release from TfL. So Transport for London data suggests lockdown free is not having the same impact as the original. Tube use is at 18% this morning compared with roughly 5% last April. Bus use is at 30% compared to 18% last April. And road traffic is at 76% compared to 30 to 40% last April. And he sort of editorialized and said that's a lot of people ignoring hashtag stay at home. Now, it's unclear whether this is people ignoring the rules, or that the rules, or at least the rules are slightly different this time around, but also the way people are responding to them is different this time around. And that's partly because back in March and April, people actually acted over and above the rules. So it was the case that the government had allowed many businesses to stay open if they couldn't work from home, but businesses closed anyway. This time around, that's much less likely to happen. That means there are many more people who aren't just going on the tube because they want to go shopping. I mean, they can't go shopping, all the shops are closed. They aren't just going on the tube because they want to visit a friend. They're going on a tube because their boss has asked them to go into work. So we can't blame the fact this lockdown isn't working as well on just individual actions. It's also the fact that more people are being required to go into their jobs. That's something the government should be sorting out now. But it is also probably true that people are less scared of the virus now. I do notice this around. There are people who are going out more than they were back in March, and that's because people, I think, they understand the risk to themselves. So people back in March were completely confused. What is this virus? I think now people in certain age groups realize that if they get it, it's not going to be the end of the world. Maybe they've had it already, so are not behaving in exactly the same way that they were last year. Now, this different behavior, I think, is one of the reasons why Sadiq Khan today declared a major incident in London.
Well, the reason I've had to declare a major incident today is because I'm afraid this virus is out of control. The NHS in London is at a risk of being overwhelmed. The staff there are working heroically, but it's a real risk over the course of the next couple of weeks. Unless the virus reduces and there are a few people going to hospital, we could run out of beds. Across London, on average, 1 out of 30 Londoners now has this virus, but in some parts of London, it's 1 out of 20. The number of people now in hospital with COVID is 35% more than the peak in spring. The NHS is doing an amazing job. They are stretched. But to give you an example, normally, the ambulance service on a daily basis receives about 5,000 calls a day. They're receiving between 8,000 and 9,000 calls a day, which is why our brilliant firefighters and are driving some ambulances. But it's really important that the additional measures I've asked from the government are given to us, but also Londoners heed this warning. The best thing you can do, the best way you can help the NHS is by staying at home.
Now, declaring a major incident in normal times, or if you call it normal times, it's normally to say something is happening so seriously in this place that we need to call upon resources from elsewhere. So, for example, when the Grenfell fire happened, then London's fire brigade could call on resources from elsewhere. Hospitals could call on resources from elsewhere. This time around, that's difficult because everywhere is under complete, is at breaking point essentially because of COVID-19. So I think this is more about the messaging of, saying to the public, this is an emergency, please do stay at home. Dalia, I want to bring you in on sort of, your analysis of why this lockdown isn't working quite as well as the last one. Do you think that people aren't necessarily taking COVID-19 seriously enough this time around, or do you think it's mainly down to the government's, everyone's lost patience with the government and the rules, but also the rules have changed slightly in terms of what is and what isn't allowed?
Yeah, I mean, it's very clear now that the lockdown strategies that we relied on March, whether it's, the actual strategies themselves or whether it's how it's playing out, are not enough to keep this new strain under control. And I think, it's too late anyway. And I think part of the disillusionment comes from the idea that even if we do kind of play by the rules, and even if we do kind of put in all of our effort, like a lot of us did in March, there is a sense that the government will find a way to fail us anyway. But I don't think it is just that people are ignoring it. I think that, in my own personal conversations, especially with workers, I think we're seeing a lot of examples of managers basically being more willing to put their workers at risk, and making incredibly nonsensical and dangerous decisions. One example is that in big companies like Boots and Superdrug, beauty counter workers, so the women that stand largely a feminized workforce that stand and spritz you with perfume or like help you pick out different creams and stuff, are being told that they have to go to work still. Their managers are printing out letters so that they can be classified as key workers and therefore send their kids to school. Now, as much as I miss playing around with lipsticks in stores, that is not a routine, that is not a key or critical form of work. And you also have examples like the fact that a lot of routine health appointments are continuing at the same level of a full clinic. So we're talking opticians, we're talking dentists, we're talking even routine appointments in hospitals are continuing even with the same, at the same capacity as is during sort of normal non-COVID times. So therefore not kind of leaving enough time between appointments. And that, in March, there were no routine healthcare appointments. So there is a kind of top-down message happening there, coming both from the government, but also from bosses that are basically being a lot more cavalier. I think that in March, we were all sort of very much taken by surprise. And there was a sense of, because we don't know how this thing operates and we don't know how this thing works, a lot of people kind of went into on the back foot. But I think bosses are being much more willing. And that's possibly why we're seeing the capacity of the tubes higher as well. But, for me as well, this has really hit home in many ways. A lot of the realities about sort of London and how we think about geographic politics in this country, because, we often cite that London is, it's a central site of like global finance, and there are some kind of positive somewhat accidental side effects for working class people as a result of that. Things like, having a tube system and stuff like that. But there is also a real brutality and a real disadvantages that come from living in the center of like in a financial core in that way. And one of those things is that the purpose of this city is to generate wealth for a very small group of people. And your life is absolutely meaningless in the face of that primary aim. And, we saw that in the shocking easing down of the lockdown, which happened far too prematurely in December, where people were being encouraged to flood retail and hospitality industries, even though it was highly inappropriate in terms of public health. And that was so that big companies could make their Christmas bottom line. And now we're seeing that culminating in 1 in 30 Londoners having COVID. So I think that, those two elements for me is what really struck out in this story, the prevalence of it in London, and also the fact that we are seeing a lot of bosses, a lot of managers really trying to play fast and loose with the rules this time in a way that we didn't see in March.
Yeah, I'm glad you also brought up in December when people were encouraged to open their businesses and people were encouraged to go and shop and use those businesses, because this links to the next graphic I want to show you. Now, this was put together by the National Education Union using ONS statistics. There was a new ONS report today. It actually confirmed what we already knew because Boris Johnson announced it yesterday, which was that 1 in 50 people in the UK have COVID, 1 in 30 in London have COVID. But they tweeted this graph out, basically because it shows how irresponsible the government had been prior to Christmas. So what you can see here is that, as you're getting towards the end of November, among all age groups, COVID-19 was beginning to fall, less among secondary school kids because they were still open, but it was starting to fall among all groups. Then once the lockdown is loosened, you can see quite how much it just rockets. Now that's partly because of the new strain, but it's just as much because they opened the economy. They opened the rest of the economy, even though cases had barely gone down at all. I don't know what they were thinking. The particular reason why the NEU shared this, though, is because it's showing you that by the end of December, when the government were actually launching legal cases against schools who wanted to close early before Christmas, a very, very responsible policy. But they were saying, if you do that, we'll have a legal challenge to force you not to. 3.5% or more than 3.5% of secondary school aged children had COVID-19. So that on average means, and on average, because the way COVID works, these are probably clustered, but on average, you've got one person with COVID-19 in every classroom in the country, right? And they're saying, if you close early, we're going to sue you. This is, so infuriating that this was allowed to happen when they'd been told about this so early on. This shouldn't have been a surprise. Shocking. We're going to go on to our next story, because the shining light at the end of all of this, the lockdown is worse than, the situation is worse than it was back in March, but it could get better because we have a vaccine in the pipeline. Our next story is about vaccines. First of all, I want to go to 2 comments. Carolyn Cook with $10, long-time listener, first-time live stream watcher. So grateful for Novara's commitment to changing the way we do media and the brilliant quality content. Much Aurora, I can't pronounce it. Much Aurora love from New Zealand. Now, all of our viewers, Carolyn, thank you so much for that super chat, first of all, but all of our viewers are going to be so jealous that you're in New Zealand, because whilst we are in this complete COVID hell at the moment, your government was responsible enough to shut down travel coming into the country and to take fast, serious measures to get to a zero COVID situation. The UK is also an island. There's no reason why that wouldn't have been possible. And Michael Deary with £5 super chat, thank you so much. It's scary how normalized the death rate is now. The highest number of deaths in 24 hours ever, and the top trend on Twitter is Jurgen Klopp. Scary. I couldn't agree with you more. The fact that 1,345 or 325 people died in the last, or whose deaths were recorded in the last 24 hours. And I think people are more and more immune to this. Back in the summer, when there was sort of suggestions, there might be a bit of a second wave. I remember listening actually to it was either to Neil Ferguson or John Edmonds, I can't remember which one of it was, but one of the top modelers who was speaking to Radio 4, and they were asked, will we see a wave as bad in March this winter? And they said, look, there's no epidemiological reason why we won't, because the way viruses work, there's every reason to believe it would get more serious in winter. The reason we don't think it will get quite as bad is because we don't think the government could possibly make exactly the same mistake again. People saw that because of acting late last time around, we ended up having more than 1,000 people dying a day. Surely this time around, when the same signals are coming in terms of the development of the virus, we will have learned from our mistakes and we will respond differently. Now, they're epidemiologists. They're not supposed to predict the future when it comes to politics, but they were completely wrong. I have to say, I found that convincing. I thought our politicians would behave differently this time around. They haven't, and we're in an even worse situation than we were then. Our next story. The nation that tops the league table for vaccinations is currently Israel. So they have already vaccinated 1.7 million people, which is almost 20% of the country's population. We can look at the league table now. Boris Johnson always tells us Britain has done more vaccinations than the rest of Europe. That's his sort of big, what he's very proud of doing. And the United Kingdom is, it's in 4th place. It's not a particularly bad record, but way ahead there is Israel. And you can see behind them United Arab Emirates and Bahrain, 2 countries with very small populations. Now, how has Israel done this? How have they had a much better performance in terms of vaccinating their population quickly than anyone else? Well, one is they paid above the odds for the Pfizer vaccine. So the precise figures are confidential. All of these deals are confidential, which I think has a lot of political problems associated with it anyway, but that's the way it is. But we understand from sources close to the government that they've potentially paid about twice as much for the vaccine as European governments. Now, this is an example of vaccine nationalism. It's countries competing with each other, paying the highest amount to get the vaccine before other people. But for Israeli citizens, they're going to be very happy with this. And there are also plaudits for the distribution of this vaccine. So they have managed to get it out quite quickly to most people above 60. They're also, which is quite interesting, they don't want to waste any of the doses. So there are young people waiting outside vaccination centres. At the end of the day, if they've got some unused vaccines, then you can go in there, even if you're not in a priority group, and get a vaccine. So on a technocratic level, potentially things to learn from the rest of the world. But, and you could probably predict this was coming, there is a big but. Israel is also being accused of vaccine apartheid. That's because the 4.5 million Palestinians that live under Israeli occupation are not entitled to the jab. On Wednesday, 2 Palestinian officials told the New York Times that the Palestinian Authority had asked Israel for up to 10,000 doses of the vaccine to immunize Palestinian frontline workers. Israel refused. So this isn't even the case of, they're not, it's not just that they're not immunizing Palestinians on an equal basis to the Israelis. They're not giving them even the basics that they need to keep their healthcare system functioning. Now, to discuss this darker side of Israel's vaccination program, I'm delighted to be joined by Yara Asi, a postdoctoral scholar in the Department of Health Management and Informatics at the University of Central California. Now, Yara has written in Florida. Sorry, what did I say? California? University of Central Florida. Yara has, it was correct in my notes. It was just I must have read it wrong. Yara has written extensively on the politics of healthcare in Palestine. Thank you so much for joining me today. Apologies for getting a university.
Thank you for having me.
Now, first of all, can you talk through the basic politics of this? So
Sure.
The Israelis are arguing that because of the Oslo Accords, actually the Palestinian Authority has responsibility for the health of its citizens. It's only their job to vaccinate Israeli citizens. It's nothing to do with them whether or not the Palestinians do or don't have vaccines. Critics of that position obviously say, well, you're occupying that country, so this is all. I mean,
minor detail.
Can you talk our audience through the complexities there, or maybe it's not even that complex, the issues there?
Sure. Yeah. Well, first off, thanks for having me. Thanks for talking about this. This is such an important issue. Without boring your audience with the intricacies of international humanitarian law, suffice it to say that, yes, the Oslo Accords were signed in the mid-90s, but let's remember that the Oslo Accords are meant to be a 5-year interim agreement. And so, number one, citing them almost 30 years later for a pandemic, which they surely were not written to deal with, is a bit disingenuous. And secondly, many of the other parts of Oslo that were meant to benefit Palestinians have been implemented. I mean, for example, there's supposed to be safe passage between the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, and it's almost impossible to travel between them. The ICRC, the United Nations, multiple international bodies, almost every country with very few exceptions still recognizes Israel as the occupying power. And as a result, under the Fourth Geneva Convention, they have this responsibility. It's an inconvenient, situation. However, military occupation is also not meant to last 50 years. It is very tough to, manage these two populations. But on the other hand, give the Palestinian Authority an autonomous government, and then we can criticize them and their actions. And I want to further emphasize that just because the Palestinian Authority has been in talks with Russia and the World Health Organization and other entities to procure vaccines on their own, the Geneva Conventions also mandates that humanitarian assistance from external actors does not displace Israel's responsibility towards Palestinian health. Unfortunately, this is not a surprise. As early as we saw in the pandemic, Israeli ministers were saying the Palestinian situation is too much for Israel to handle. We have to deal with our own citizens as well. So this was inevitable to all watchers.
And can you talk a bit more actually about the general politics or the experience actually of a pandemic for Palestinians whilst also being under occupation? I mean, how have those two, to call them challenges is a bit of an understatement, but how have those two, challenges intersected with each other, let's say?
Well, it's kind of interesting because, as I'm sure most of your viewers know, Gaza is under blockade, so it's almost impossible to get in or out, and the West Bank is similarly very closed off. It's very difficult to get in or out. So at the beginning of the pandemic, people almost thought this would be a benefit. If we can keep population controls, which are already basically in place in that part of the world, then that's great if we can keep infections out. And this showed in early data that most, the Palestinian territories didn't really start seeing a significant amount of cases until July, when most countries were already in their second or third wave. But the problem is, once it came in, it entered a completely depleted health system, a very poor population, a decimated economy, which was losing GDP even last in 2018 and 2019, let alone this year. So it's been very, very difficult. And luckily, the Palestinian population is quite young. The median age is somewhere in the 20s. So as we all know, COVID is particularly dangerous for the more elderly population. So we haven't seen a super high case fatality rate, which is good news. But unfortunately, what that means is people who do end up having COVID are sometimes encouraged to end up not going to the hospital because there may not be capacity. So then you end up with only people who are really suffering, that really need advanced care. Then they're the ones that need to be hospitalized. And by the time you're at that stage, it's much more difficult to help somebody. And also there's more pressure to get the economy back open, because unemployment is so high. So people who have jobs are desperate to get back to them. Hundreds of thousands of Palestinians cross into Israel every day to build Israeli infrastructure. I think 70 to 80% of Israeli construction are Palestinian day laborers. You have obviously Israeli settlers that live within the West Bank, driving on the same roads. You have, of course, Israeli soldiers still manning checkpoints in the West Bank, still raiding homes and demolishing homes in the West Bank. All of that has continued. So add that to a pandemic where you're out of testing kits, ventilators, you're out of ICU beds. It's a confluence of events that was entirely predictable, and yet, here we are.
And as a final question to get you to see into the future, always a difficult one to end on. I mean, on a practical level, when do you see Palestinians getting the vaccine? You mentioned that the Palestinian Authority is trying to get some from the Russians. Right. There's also COVAX, which is the World Health Organization's program. The Israelis have suggested that maybe they'll give some vaccines to the Palestinians after they've vaccinated their own citizens. Right. What do you see as being the reality of this going forward?
So as you noted earlier in the broadcast, a lot of these COVID negotiations are kind of closed door, and it's been very tough to follow this over the last couple of weeks. The most recent reporting that I've seen says that they should start getting their first shipments outside of Israel, from external sources in early February. Not sure how many or who will be prioritized in terms of getting that vaccine. But this week, this story has been so much in the news, and Israel is susceptible to public pressure and their public image with regard to the Palestinians. So I would not be surprised to see some bending on this due to international pressure. And of course, the obvious and pragmatic fact that if your neighboring country still has a raging pandemic, that's not good for you either. So it's both external and internal pressure to deal with this situation.
Dr. Yara Asi, thank you so much for your
Thanks
time
for
this
having
evening.
me.
All extremely interesting, very, very insightful. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
We are going to go on to our final story. First of all, a comment from Deborah Rinaldi with a €10 super chat. Thank you very much. Hi, Michael. Could you wish my husband, Matt, a happy birthday? We're both big fans of Novara Media, following from Spain. Thanks for all the great work. Our best wishes to all the team. Happy birthday, Matt. Thank you so much, Deborah. I'm going to bring Dahlia back in. We're going to go to our final story in one moment. God, I can't wait to get the vaccine, Dahlia. The whole world is waiting, aren't they?
Yeah, and I feel like the government's going to find a way to cock it up. I don't know how. They're going to do it in some out of left way that I could have never, ever predicted, but fingers crossed they'll prove me wrong.
I mean, the important issue though here is though, this is when the dynamic of the pandemic is really going to change, because at the moment it has been the richer countries that have been more affected, partly because of the parts of the world they're in, and also I think, I suppose the age profile is the main reason. But once the rich countries hoover up all of the vaccines, that's when you're going to start to see sort of global inequality really come into how COVID-19 sort of affects different countries, and especially where the deaths are most common. Let's go to our final story. Elon Musk has become the world's richest person after the share price of his company Tesla increased. Now, his net worth now reportedly stands at $185 billion. This means he has overtaken the previous holder of this title, Amazon founder Jeff Bezos. Now, this is from a BBC report. They write, Mr. Musk's electric car company Tesla has surged in value this year and hit a market value of $700 billion or £516 billion for the first time on Wednesday. That makes the car company worth more than Toyota, Volkswagen, Hyundai, GM, and Ford combined. Now, that is phenomenal. This is a company which has only turned a profit this year. It hasn't turned a profit before that because it's been spending more than it has been taking in. Now, they are all the biggest car companies in the world. Enormous revenue. So is this a bubble? Is this investors getting completely carried away by the fact that the price keeps going up, a bit like with Bitcoin or something? Or are people betting that electric cars are the future and that Tesla is completely going to dominate that market? Whatever happens, Elon Musk is probably going to have a lot of money. This is what he says he wants to spend it on. So this is from a tweet from a little while ago. He says, about half my money is intended to help problems on Earth and half to help establish a self-sustaining city on Mars to ensure continuation of life of all species in case Earth gets hit by a meteor like the dinosaurs or World War III happens and we destroy ourselves. Now, the chances of a meteoroid hitting this country, sorry, it's very parochial of me there. A meteoroid hitting the planet in the near future are very small. Much more likely is it becomes uninhabitable because of climate change. So I'd kind of prefer him to be investing that money in green technologies instead of getting to Mars. I doubt that many people can live on Mars, although you could say the electric cars kind of falls into that. Dalia, I want your take on this. What does it say about capitalism that Elon Musk is now the world's richest man?
I mean, it tells me that wealth is generated on completely fraudulent and ridiculous bases. I have to say that I'm actually kind of surprised that he overtook Bezos in this particular moment. Like, obviously, these kind of figures change a lot. They change like very frequently. But, you know, Amazon has just harnessed the coronavirus crisis so effectively that I just kind of expected it to be like solidly Bezos for a while. But obviously, you know, we need to pierce through this ridiculous myth making that happens around people like Elon Musk. You know, this idea that he is just like this genius, and he's frequently called a genius by politicians. And, you know, politicians in the US in particular really kind of like helped to fabricate this. Trump called him a genius multiple times. California legislators and governors all kind of play into this. He did not amass this wealth through any individual genius. He's not even the actual legit co-founder of Tesla. He actually essentially bought that label through an out-of-court settlement with the actual people that did found Tesla. He amassed this wealth from union busting on an unprecedented scale, government subsidies, $4.9 billion of government subsidies to be precise, you know, violating basic labor and health and safety standards. The most recent example of that was when he insisted on opening the Tesla factories, despite that violating the local coronavirus lockdown rules in California. And actually, the rules around lockdown changed. You know, California changed those rules in order to accommodate Elon Musk wanting to open up his factory. His wealth also comes from the fact that, you know, the money that kicked off his career comes from the fact that his family were involved in the emerald mining business in South Africa, which in apartheid South Africa. And, you know, the mining business especially was absolutely central to the economic fabric of apartheid. Mining is a really central, and it continues to be a central site of very heavy exploitation and violence against Black Southern Africans. And, you know, it's often said that there's no such thing as a self-made billionaire. And I think Elon Musk is a perfect case study of that. So really, you know, the kind of mythologizing that we will be seeing of Elon Musk and people like him is pretty nauseating. He's sort of part of this emerging, it's particularly prevalent in Silicon Valley, this emerging cult of the tech billionaire, or the, you know, the uber wealthy sort of innovator. Which kind of, in a sense, gave rise to Trump. You know, this idea that, you know, billionaires will save us from the big structural issues of the day. And that, you know, Elon Musk, when the pandemic started, he said that he was going to provide California with loads of ventilators that, you know, again, which is what prompted the California led politicians to treat him like some kind of messiah. And then it ended up actually that he was providing CPAP machines, which weren't in any kind of, which weren't, you know, there was like, which wasn't under resourced and is, you know, far cheaper and far easier to make than ventilators. But also this idea that, you know, we should put more billionaires and more millionaires in government because, and Trump used this a lot, and I think it really contributed to his appeal that, you know, he's going to run the country in the way that he runs one of his businesses, which, to be fair, he's kind of delivered on because, you know, most of his businesses ended in bankruptcy and, you know, a garbage fire, which is kind of also now what's happening in the US. But in reality, these very people are the very cause of a lot of the problems that we are facing, including the climate crisis, as you pointed out, Michael.
I'm not sure if SpaceX is probably not particularly environmentally friendly. I've got no idea how much fuel it takes to get a rocket into space. The electric cars, I suppose it depends what precisely he's putting in them. But I mean, whatever you think about how he made his wealth, we can probably all agree no one needs $185 billion. It's obscene. Dalia Gabriel, thank you so much for joining me this evening. It has been a delight.
Thanks for having
Enjoy
me,
your
Michael.
locked-in weekend.
Yeah, I'm just going stir. I didn't even go stir crazy in the first lockdown, but I'm going stir crazy this time. So yeah, it's any tips to get through it, send them my way. I've exhausted all of my hobbies.
Yeah, just watch more TV now. Watch more TV. You don't need to feel that
Yeah.
you're being productive this time around because there's an end in sight. If you're watching TV all day, you are doing something for society. that is you know, living the life that society wants you to live. So embrace it, and all of our audience embrace it. Watch loads of, you can watch back episodes of Tysky Sour if you want to. Anytime you are watching TV, anytime you're watching TV over the next 2 months, you are doing God's work. I think is the message right now.
Oh, that's a nice silver lining.
That's how I like to think about it. Dalia Gabriel, see you next Friday.
See you next Friday.
And to our audience, thank you so much for joining us again for an episode of Tysky Sour. As ever, if you want to support the work we do, please do go to novaramedia.com/support this channel, this show. It's all only possible because of our subscribers. I know loads of you are already subscribed, so thank you so much. If you're not already, do consider going to our website and donating the equivalent of 1 hour's wage a month. For now, have a good weekend inside. Be sensible. I'm Michael Walker. You've been watching Tysky Sour on Novara Media. Good night.